Predict, pick, and prevail in your fantasy football leagues with Nick Giacobbe and Nick Kap. From breakouts to busts, superstars to sleepers, these are the guys that will help you achieve fantasy glory. This is the PrimeTime Fantasy Podcast.
Welcome everybody to Season 4, Episode 29 of the PrimeTime Fantasy Football Podcast, where we give you our predictions, our picks, with the hopes that we help you prevail throughout Week 7. Is it Week 7? I think it's Week 7,
yep.
And the rest of the 2024 fantasy football season. I'm your host, Nick Giacobbe. Joining me is Nick Kap. We are recording. It is late Wednesday night on October 16th. I took a flight tonight, and I'm back in New York here. We have a good show for you guys. Our first show, they're actually going to be not breaking news. Can't call it breaking news because the news broke, but first time this season, we're actually going to talk about some significant news, and then followed by our all boom and all bust teams. We do not have deep sleepers for you guys on this show. Normally, we do a nice deep sleeper segment at the end of our Friday show, but instead, there's some big enough news that we have to talk about that, and we didn't want to smush everything in. But if you do want some deep sleepers from us, make sure to join our Sunday morning live show, 8:30 a.m. Eastern time. It's going to be right before that last London game of the season, the Patriots at the Jaguars. But if you want some deep sleepers, we actually reveal this week's deep sleepers on the Sunday morning live show. So, Nick, welcome. And we're recording late. Big week, all boom, all bust, a lot to talk about.
Yeah, man, huge week. You see the hat. For those of you that have been around, you know who I support.
I see the hat. So before Nick gets into it,
we're not going to get to the news. We're not going to get to the news.
We're going to get
three massive trades this week. Nick will bring up two of them. Obviously, Cam Akers, Viking, Jets former quarterback. Sam Darnold gets a huge weapon. Just kidding, obviously not. We know what we're talking about today.
I'm kind of surprised that they even dealt Akers. Not really going to talk about it, but I'm kind of surprised they dealt Akers when he kind of filled that role with Mixon out. But I digress.
This is the second time they traded for him.
Yeah,
they traded for him last year when he was a Ram. And then they traded for him now. It makes no sense.
I'm surprised that the Texans dealt him because I thought he wasn't fumbling or anything. But anyway, if this is your first time listening to the show or watching the show on YouTube, thank you so much for joining the Primetime Fantasy Football Podcast. We give you two shows during the week. That live show that I already mentioned, it's going to be Sunday morning, 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. It's every single Sunday throughout the fantasy football season. You can find us on all social media platforms and all audio streaming platforms if you rather listen to us in podcast form. So again, if you're a first-time listener, thank you for that. Our Friday show is normally our all boom and all bust teams, which we'll talk about in a second. And then we give you guys two deep sleepers. Me and Nick each give you a deep sleeper that you should pick up before the week. But because of the significant news that broke, I think it was Tuesday. I thought it was Monday, but it's actually Tuesday. We have to talk about that. So, Nick, let's talk about the biggest news of the week. Your favorite team traded a wide receiver. The Cleveland Browns traded Amari Cooper to the Buffalo New York Bills.
Yep.
New York's team. It was a clean sweep for the New York teams on Monday night. The Rangers won. The Islanders won. I think the Mets played. The Yankees won. And New York's own Buffalo Bills won. So it was actually a clean sweep. Josh Allen gets a good target in Amari Cooper. I think it's pretty significant fantasy news. I'll talk about him at some point this week, but I think it's pretty significant at least.
No, for sure. Listen, I think the Bills clearly had a void at wide receiver. We'll talk about the Jets trade right after this, but I do think when you talk about like gap filling it, improvement, like the Bills definitely improved significantly with the Amari Cooper deal. People are critiquing Cooper because, he's washed, he's whatever. No, he had literally one of the worst starting quarterbacks in the league throwing on the ball. He was top 5 in targets on the season. He was having a good year in terms of creating spacing and game scripts and things like that. And Josh Allen gets a very valuable weapon there. As a Jets fan, not too happy about it because I do think that they improved more than the Jets improved with their trade. But at the same time, listen, I think Amari Cooper, this is clearly the best quarterback he's had in his career. We've seen him with other stat sheet stuffers, and Josh isn't too much of a stat sheet stuffer because it does feel like it translates to wins and things like that. But you look at the numbers he had with Dak Prescott. He was a perennial top 10 drafted wide receiver. On the back,
the numbers he had with Joe Flacco last year.
Yeah, exactly. Listen, when he has a quarterback that can get him the ball, he can create space and create opportunity. And that's exactly what Buffalo needed in a wide receiver one. I think he's a great fit there. I think he's more of a pro. He doesn't seem like as big of a diva as a guy like Stephon Diggs. So I like the move. I think it's going to be very big for fantasy. I think we're going to see a lot more of those Buffalo Bills receivers. Someone's going to step into that 2 role, and we'll see who that is. And then they're not as much of a focus on the defense. I think it made a lot of sense for them.
I echo and agree with all of Nick's points. I believe that both Amari Cooper and Calvin Ridley might both lead the league in uncatchable passes. Because they're both good, but the passes they've been receiving have not really been catchable. My concerns for Amari Cooper, number one, is the weather. I don't think he plays too well in cold weather, and Buffalo plays in cold weather, so that's going to be a little bit of an issue. My other concerns is the Bills have been spreading the ball around a lot, and Josh Allen has made many comments about that he actually prefers to spread the ball around instead of like force feeding a receiver. This is going to hurt Shakir, obviously, who's been a top 25 receiver on the season already. And Dalton Kincaid's breakout is just not going to happen. I'm throwing in the towel on that one. So those are my thoughts on Cooper. Like, if you're a Cooper owner, you have to be ecstatic, though, because this is an upgrade. Watson is just not getting it done. I don't want to own any Brown in fantasy. I do own one. It's Jerome Ford on my dynasty, team. And I picked him up off the waivers, I think last year or something. So I'm not upset about that. But I wouldn't want to own any Brown in fantasy. So.
Sure.
All right. Moving on. Knicks Jets did make a trade. They traded for Davante Adams. A trade that was kind of made weeks ago or last year was finally completed. Aaron Rodgers gets his buddy back. Now, here's the thing. I don't want to burst Nick's bubble, but on this show, I did call that game on Monday a winner or go home game for the Jets. And the Jets didn't play bad. They missed a couple kicks. The referees were atrocious on both sides, probably a little bit more in favor of Buffalo, but they were atrocious on both sides. As an unbiased viewer, and again, I was actually rooting for the Jets because I like competitive football and I like to see the most teams compete. And I was facing Josh Allen in fantasy, so I actually was rooting for the Jets.
Sure.
I was.
We'll buy that.
Yeah, I was rooting for the Jets. I was rooting for the Jets. I was rooting for the Jets up until halftime when I saw that Josh Allen already beaten me, and then I was real salty about it. I'm like, screw it. Zerline screwed me over by missing kicks, and the Jets defense turned into Swiss cheese. But I actually had 2 Jets going in another league. So I had Braylon Allen and Garrett Wilson. I needed them to combine for like 60 or something. So I actually was rooting for the Jets. But I called it a winner or loser go home game. The AFC is really tough. Nick's kind of already said, I don't know how much it really helps the team. I think their biggest issue is coaching, but this isn't a fantasy show. It's a fantasy show. I think it's a better situation for Davante Adams, and I'll let Nick go first. But I think it's definitely if you drafted Davante Adams, you were kind of drafting him hoping for something like this.
Yeah, I mean, Davante to me clearly gets a tick up for fantasy. Garrett Wilson goes down. Whatever you want to spin it as, Garrett Wilson led the league in targets. Period. End of story. He cannot do that with Davante Adams.
And I think he back-to-back weeks of 20-plus points, right? Did it even another 20-plus game this week?
He had his 2 best games of the year. He's the wide receiver 7 right now in full PPR. So as much as we critiqued him at the start of the year, he worked his way all the way back up into the top 10. He was drafted as the 6th or 7th receiver off the board. He's right where he was drafted to be. And he can't be that anymore with Davante. Unfortunately, it is what it is for your fantasy team.
But could he? Mike Evans and Chris Godwin are both in the top 10. I agree with you. I don't think he will, but I wouldn't.
He's not going to lead the league in targets. He can't lead the league in targets anymore.
No, he won't.
It can't happen.
No.
And if he gets a 20% reduction in his target share, which would make sense, he'd still be a great receiver, but he'll be the wide receiver 12 to 18 by the end of the year. He's not going to be a top 10 receiver for fantasy.
Sure.
And that's okay. That's okay because I'm a Jets fan and I love it. And I do think Davante makes us better. I do think we walk into Pittsburgh, we show Russell Wilson that, hey, buddy, slow that Bronco down. Screw you. You're not cooking this Jets secondary. Then we go into New England the following week, 4-4. Now we got a team.
Okay.
So listen, the schedule, not a lot easier. Nick, have you ever heard of the stat DVOA?
I have. It's a stat that a couple of my Seahawks Twitter followers love because the Pete Carroll Seahawks used to crush DVOA.
So the Jet, and for the viewers at home that don't know what it is, it's kind of like defensive value over the average. If you're a baseball fan, it sounds like it's the war of defense. So how good you are above the average team at that position. The Jets have had the hardest DVOA of any team in football through 6 weeks. The defenses that they have played have been elite. And say what you want, Davante Adams will make them better in those late game situations.
Sure.
The last 3 games, they lost to Denver when they had a chance to make a field goal. 2 weeks ago, Aaron Rodgers throws the ball to Mike Williams, intercepted by Stephon Gilmore, a game he did not play well in against the Minnesota Vikings. And then last week, interception thrown to Mike Williams. Mike Williams will be off the field. It will be Davante Adams, a receiver he more so trusts. Regardless, on the back half of the year, the Jets have the easiest DVOA of any team in the league. So the defenses they are facing, they pretty much went from the average of the toughest schedule in terms of defenses that they played to the easiest schedule in football. I am not saying and echoing that my Jets are going to make the playoffs. I am telling you for a fact their schedule is easier for the wide receiver position.
Sure.
For your fantasy football teams, I think all 3 will be somewhat playable. I don't think any 3 of them are going to head and shoulders be above the rest. I would love to see it happen. I think you're going to see some good games from each of them. I think Allen Lazard will still be the red zone threat for this team. I think he has way too many touchdowns. Rodgers loves him in the red zone. He's a very tall receiver. He's 6'5", big guy, big target. That will hurt Davante and Garrett Wilson's production, period. So for your fantasy team, we got to see it. And they get one of their, again, they've had a tough defensive schedule. They get the Pittsburgh Steelers this week. The Steelers are a top 5 defense in football. The Steelers are winning games, not scoring touchdowns. Like it's going to be a very difficult game, and we're going to see it. It's one of the lowest over-unders of the week. So let's see what these Jets receivers look like this week. If I had to project, I would guess Garrett Wilson is probably a wide receiver 1 down to wide receiver 2. Davante was drafted to be a wide receiver 2. He's down to a low end 2 to mid end 3. And Allen Lazard will be a flex play depending on the week, touchdown or bust every single time.
I would smash Davante Adams touchdown on Sunday night. He's getting in the
end zone. Force fed.
Yeah. I think Lazard is cooked. I just dropped him for the Saints receiver. Maney. I think Lazard is cooked. And that's a shame because I've been kind of, gassing Lazard up a little bit on this show over the past few weeks. I mean, I'm looking at Lazard's numbers. He's the wide receiver 11 right now in fantasy. He has 5 out of 6 games over double digits. 2 of them are over 20. But Rodgers just isn't going to throw 40 times. There's only so many targets to go around. Like Nick said, it's touchdown or bust. But do you really want to play the Jets wide receiver 3 when I think they are a run first and play defense kind of team? So
that's what Todd Downing said, the offensive coordinator. That's what they want their identity to be. And you saw it for Breece Hall. Breece Hall was a 100-yard rusher last week, coming off 2 very poor games for fantasy. Garrett and Lazard were 2 100-yard receivers. So it's not to say that the Jets can't produce the numbers, but the stat that everyone points to, Aaron Rodgers hasn't thrown for 300 yards in 3 years, period.
Right.
So you're not going to see all 3 of those guys be 100-yard receivers every single week or even close to it. It's not going to happen. So I don't want to harp on it too much because we are a fantasy show, but I will say this. I feel
it is
better about my Jets.
It is fantasy relevant because that makes Rodgers a less fantasy relevant quarterback if he's not going to throw for 300 yards any given week.
Sure. Yep.
All right, so that was our little news segment there. If any other questions regarding these players, again, Sunday morning, 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. Going to go now to our all boom and all bust teams. So here's the way the all boom and all bust teams work. So when we post them on social media, not everybody understands it, and that's okay because you're only seeing a graphic. So the way that the all boom, all bust teams works, we basically try to get flex players or fringe players that maybe weren't going to start, especially with bye weeks and injuries. And we tell you if they're going to boom or bust. Now, the bust players, we will bust stars. We've successfully bust Jamar Chase. We've successfully put Tyreek Hill on the all bust team. We've successfully put Jonathan Taylor on the all bust team. And basically, it's underperforming their ADP by like a severe margin. Not like, you're projected 16 and you hit 15. Like, no, you scored 8.
Yeah.
So the all bust team, we do put stars on the all boom team. It's kind of flex or fringe players that we think could boom this week and should be in your lineup. So Nick, who is, and I also want to note that, we have 7 all boom, 7 all bust, and it's completely different. So you have 14 booms and 14 busts because me and Nick are each giving you, 1 of each. And on top of that, the way that it normally works is, we have an anonymous source here, and I'll send my boom and Nick will send his bust, and then we will have to change players to make sure we don't have any duplicates. So one of our teams is a little bit maybe lopsided than the other one. Neither of us had to change anything this week, which is a first, and especially when there's like a couple teams on bye. I think the Bears, a couple others, no changes. So Nick, all boom. So that means we got our first priority.
28 players.
Who's
total.
your all boom quarterback?
All unique, all our priority.
28. Yep.
Quarterback.
All right. Who's your first all boom for quarterback?
I'm going with Jordan Love.
Nick loves Jordan Love, and I will say Nick's been beating the Jordan Love drum for the past year or two. So
listen, say what you want. I'm a Jets fan. I'm a Packers shareholder. I own 0.0000019% of that team. I have no shares and nothing that actually impacts the team, but I have a document that says I own the Green Bay Packers. So I am going to go rep my guy, Jordan Love. 3rd most points per game at the quarterback position this year. He missed 2 games due to injury. And guess what? The Jordan Love-led Packers are a much better team than people give them credit for. The Packers rank top 10 in pass attempts per game with Jordan Love in there. They rank 4th in most plays per game, which means the defense is forcing turnovers. They lead the league in turnovers, and they give the quarterback the ball, which gives them a lot more opportunity to put up fantasy points, which is great for your fantasy team, obviously. Now they go up against the Houston Texans, one of the highest over-under games, one of the most anticipated NFC, AFC matchups of the year. 2 up-and-coming teams. Both these teams have a ton of money on them to go to the Super Bowl because people believe in their young stud quarterbacks. And the Texans defense allows top 10 points to the quarterback position. Very, very important for your fantasy team. Jordan Love has been great. He's played in 4 games this year. He has 10 touchdowns. That is 2nd most at the quarterback position over the course of the season. He is tied with Joe Burrow, who's played in 6 games, and he is behind Baker Mayfield, who is on an MVP campaign season, who has played all 6. That's very important to know. If Jordan Love can stay healthy, and honestly, if he finds a way to win this division, I think he's going to win that MVP award, because this way he is projecting his season out statistically is phenomenal. And we've seen over the past few seasons, there's been over 50 quarterbacks that start games in the NFL because the injuries at the quarterback position have been piling up. It's been a week here, a week there, 2 weeks there. But as other quarterbacks get dinged up and miss a game or two, Jordan Love is statistically going to catch up to these other guys. And I think he is a tremendous trade for. I know he's more of a pocket quarterback, which isn't great for your fantasy, but the stats have been pointing in the right direction, and that offense is loaded. Nick thinks the receivers are too inconsistent. I think that the stats.
I think the offense is loaded from an NFL perspective, a fantasy perspective. I have concerns about who I can trust.
Which benefits your pocket quarterbacks. Think about it. Baker Mayfield, QB2 on the season. That offense is loaded. That's exactly what you want from your pocket quarterbacks, and that's why I think Jordan Love, not just this week, but for the rest of the season, is kind of going to finish in the top 5.
I would have a hunch that we may have to check. We have to check ourselves here, and this is the last week we could put both of these quarterbacks on the all boom. You just mentioned him, Baker Mayfield, and it's crazy to say that. I don't know how many more weeks we could even consider him for this team. Quarterback 2 on the season right now in terms of average. Quarterback 2 on the season in terms of points. So Baker Mayfield has a 23.4 average. In 4 to 6 games, he has over 20 fantasy points. He only has 1 game this season. I should change that stat. I'm changing that stat. 5 out of 6 games, he has over 19.8 fantasy points. I know it's really obscure, but I have to throw that number in there. But again, basically he scored 20 fantasy points in 5 out of 6 games. Yeah. He also scored over 25 in 3 of those 6 games. He only has 1 stinker. He scored 9.5 points against the Denver Broncos in week 3. Stinkers happen to everybody, even Patrick Mahomes. So I'm not going to really fault him on it because the consistency is there everywhere else. Now he's facing the Baltimore Ravens, who allowed the third most fantasy points to quarterbacks, an average of 20.4. I know they played Jaden Daniels very tough last week. A great point by my co-host Nick. The Ravens are probably going to be the team that's most conditioned to actually play Jaden Daniels because they didn't let him run. They forced him to throw because they practice against Lamar every single day. So that was a recipe for disaster. And Daniels still scored 21 fantasy points. So it wasn't a disaster. It was still a really good game for Jaden Daniels. Against the Ravens, 3 quarterbacks have gone over 20 fantasy points. The only quarterback that had gone under 10 points was Josh Allen in week 4. And that was just like a Derrick Henry show. Like they wrecked Josh Allen. I also think this ends up being a higher scoring game. It's the third highest over under of the week. We have 3 really high over unders this week, and I'm going to talk about all of them. This one's at 48.5. The Bucs are also 10th in yards per game, which doesn't sound great, but they're first in points per game, which means they're scoring a lot of points. Last note I have here, and Nick, maybe we'll have a Jordan Love and Baker Mayfield MVP conversation later on in the season, but Baker through 6 games has almost 1,500 yards. He's about 11 yards shy, 15 tutties and 5 interceptions. His quarterback rating is 109.4.
Yeah.
That sounds like an MVP number. I did just look at Jordan Love's stats. Obviously Love was hurt. Love's stats are pretty solid too. I think he played 4 games, 5 games. He has 1,100 yards, 12 touchdowns to 6 interceptions and a 93.7 rating. And he probably had a slightly harder schedule as well. So Love's stats are pretty good too. But Baker, we spoke about Baker on Monday. He's going to win fantasy football championships. He is the quarterback. Him or Jaden Daniels are going to be on 95% of those championship winning teams. So
yeah,
I have a hunch that this is the last week that we could put Baker and Love on our all booms at this point.
Just another quick point for you on Baker. I talked about it last week why I do like Jaden Daniels in the game script. Lamar's record against the NFC is incredible. He has 1 losses in his entire career, like 23-24 wins. So the Ravens win in that spot, and they win big. And when they do it, it's forces the other team to have to pass the ball more, which is just going to give Baker Mayfield more fantasy points and more MVP credibility. So I am all in on Baker with you this week. Your first running back. I'm going with J.K. Dobbins, one of those guys that winds up on either the all boom or all bust team. No one thought he would wind up on these teams because he was drafted so late, but he's been great for fantasy. And the stats kind of back it up. The Cardinals defense he's also gone up against. They allow top 5 points per game to the position, which is usually a big indicator for Nick and I of who we like to play in this spot. But Dobbins has been great against these top 10 teams that allow points to the running back position. His 3 games against teams that are top 10 in that category, he was the RB4, RB5, and RB14, 22.9 points, 20.1 points, 18.2 points. In those games, he's averaging 17 carries, 120 yards, and has a touchdown in every single one of them. Nick likes Cavani Vidal. I like him too. But guess what? J.K. Dobbins this past week off the bye had his highest snap share that he's had his entire time as a Charger behind a top offensive line. And to me, there is no doubt that J.K. Dobbins is still going to own this backfield and still get those guaranteed touches, no matter how good Vidal is this week.
So Nick, last year I told all of you guys right around this point, go trade for Rachaad White. I thought he was going to be a breakout. I thought he was going to be, a league winner. Maybe breakout's not the word. He kind of already broken out. I have my guy this year, and it is Tony Pollard. And Nick mentioned it on Monday that people should go trade for Tony Pollard. I don't think people are trading Tony Pollard, but if you can trade for Tony Pollard, go get him. For this week, I'm calling him Mr. Consistent. He's over 15 fantasy points in 4 to 5 games. He had 1 stinker against Knicks Jets, who's a top defense in the league. And that was the shutdown Will Levis, shutdown Tony Pollard. The Bills, who the Titans are facing, allow the second most fantasy points to running backs, an average of 29. 5 backs they have faced have scored over 19 fantasy points, and 2 of them have scored over 28. The lowest points that a back scored was Trevor Etienne at 12.5. And Etienne's been bad. So they still gave Etienne a good game. I just want to give you Tony Pollard's playoff schedule here. December 15th, he has the Bengals at home. December 22nd, he faces the Colts. And then December 29th, he faces the Jaguars.
That's great.
Go trade for Tony Pollard. If you can get him, I don't think people want to trade him. He does have a couple tough matchups. The Bills is not a tough matchup. Then he has the Lions, the Patriots, the Chargers, the Vikings, the Texans. your trade deadline is normally November 24th-ish. That's where that Texans matchup is. He's going to have a stinker or two in there. The Titans offense is so bad at Will Levis. One of those really top defenses is going to shut him down, and that's okay. Then after the Texans, he has the Commanders, the Jaguars, the Bengals, the Colts, and the Jaguars. I think after this show, Nick, I'm going in every single one of my leagues, and I am making a mission. I'm making a mission to get Tony Pollard. When we clip stuff at the end of the year, I hope we could clip this one because Tony Pollard is going to win fantasy football championships. He is a league winner. I paused so we could clip it. All right, your second running back. Your second running back.
I liked that. That was real media professional, real trained, locked eyes with the camera, said the take, knew it's going to make it on that Instagram reel. I love it. Also, Instagram PrimeTime Fantasy Football Podcast. You can see it down below. Quick little plug for us. But back to the All Boom team. I am going with a very risky one. I am going with Kareem Hunt. First game back against the Chargers before the bye 2 weeks ago. Feels like a decade ago. He had 14 carries for 69 very nice yards and 3 targets. That's his first game back as a Kansas City Chief. Then he goes up. Then he went up against the Saints. It was the RB5 on the week. 18.7 points in full PPR, 63% snap share, 27 carries, which is tremendous. 100 yards and a touchdown. That is great to see for your fantasy team. Now they get the bye week. Now he gets back, and this is his backfield. He's going up against the San Francisco 49ers, who, yes, they're a very good team. They're a very good defense, but this is going to be his backfield. He's going to own it. He's going to have the majority of the snap share for sure. And this is a team that knows how to play against San Francisco. Last year, Super Bowl, after a 1 week break from the Pro Bowl, just like the Chiefs this week, off of the bye week, Isaiah Pacheco, who, yes, is a better running back, had 18 carries for 60 yards, but more importantly, 6 catches for 40 yards. The Kansas City Chiefs are going to scheme Kareem Hunt, who is a pass-catching running back, to catch some big balls in this game, and I like his opportunity to be a top 10 to top 12 running back this week.
Yeah, Kareem Hunt took that number 1 rollover on that play that Carson Steele fumbled. That was
that was him.
All right, my second running back, a guy who's literally on this team every single week, Brian Robinson.
Yep.
every week. I think he was on the bus. No, Eckler was on the Boom team last week. And then we have Brian Robinson. Okay. Facing off against the Carolina Panthers, who allow the most fantasy points to running backs, an average of 31.9 fantasy points. 4 backs have scored 16 plus points against the Panthers. The Commanders have scored the second most points per game, and the average of 5th most yards per game. Is a lot of opportunity for Brian Robinson. Brian Robinson also has double digits in all 5 games, including 3 over 14 fantasy points, and he has 5 touchdowns through 5 games. He's averaging a touchdown a game and about 65 rushing yards. I would like to see an uptick in that rushing yards, but they do like using him on the goal line. As long as he gets in the end zone, he's going to boom this week. Your first receiver.
I'm going with Deontay Johnson, and Nick actually sent me a stat. I had Deontay on the team already, but Nick said, if you have Deontay on the team, this is a good stat for you.
So I know my co-host very well. I know where we pull players from, and I knew I did not use Deontay Johnson. So I had a hunch that Nick did have Deontay Johnson, knowing how bad that Commies defense is. And if he didn't have Deontay Johnson, I would have loved to shout him out as an honorable mention on my team. But Nick can talk about Deontay Johnson now, who I liked, but there were 3 other receivers that I wanted on this team.
Yeah, no, totally. And listen, it lines up great for me. So I'm going to steal him and I'm going to use him. So Nick talked about it already. Commanders defense allows the 3rd most points to the wide receiver position over the course of the season, which is obviously great. Now we talk about Deontay Johnson and his numbers. He's tied for the 2nd most targets in the entire NFL. And the stat Nick gave me, he leads the NFL in red zone targets. He has 11. That's an average of almost 2 targets in the red zone per game. That is huge touchdown upside in what can be a very good and high scoring game. 2 horrible defenses. The Panthers offense has been much better with Andy Dalton. They average 22 points per game with Dalton at the helm. They have run the 8th most plays per game. They're top 10 in pass percent. So all those numbers favor Deontay Johnson to have a very good game. And then you throw in the tie to this poor defense. And I'm going to echo it one more time, just in case it wasn't heard. He leads the NFL in red zone targets. That is very big. He has 11. The second closest player has 7, just so you know. This is a huge gap and something to take advantage of in your fantasy football leagues.
I would love to know how many of those are for Andy Dalton. The stat I gave Nick didn't say that, but I would love to know the difference.
They've got to
between
pretty
Andy
much
Dalton
all
and Bryce.
because Bryce could not
I would
get that.
think so. Yeah. All right. So the first receiver I have here is Jordan Addison. Facing that Lions defense, I love picking on the Lions defense when it comes to receivers. And they were very good last week against the Cowboys, but I think the Cowboys are really bad. I think they're very suspect. The Lions allow the fourth most fantasy points to wide receivers, an average of 36.9. The other thing is they just lost Aiden Hutchinson. That is a big, big blow to their pass rush attack, and then that'll give the quarterback a little bit more time to throw. Second highest over-under of the week at 49.5. The Vikings are coming off the bye. They're hot. I think they're 5-1 or something like that. And Addison's finally healthy. He wasn't really healthy to start the season. He had a 22-point game week 4, and then he faced Knicks Jets, and the Jets are really tough against wide receivers. So he had a little bit of a stinker against the Jets, but he did have 8 targets. So Sam Darnold is still trying to find him. I'm not super concerned. I think it could be a big Addison and Jefferson game against a really bad secondary and a tough divisional matchup, a big divisional matchup. The Lions are playing really well, but so are the Vikings. So this is a big divisional matchup, and I think Addison's going to show up for it.
Yeah.
Wide receiver 1 or 2. I'm sorry, your wide receiver 2.
So I told you on Thursday to stash him. Now I'm going to tell you to play him. Demario Douglas. Warned everybody last week. I told you pick him up. I told you on Wednesday on a Friday show. I told you on Sunday you had to add him because he's getting this guaranteed workload in this offense, and he did it again. 9 targets for the third out of the 4 straight weeks. 3 times in the last 4 weeks he has gotten 9 targets, and obviously this was the first game with Drake May. Drake May, by the way, 3 touchdowns in his rookie game. Good for him. He's another one of those deep guys that Nick and I kind of like, especially in this spot start matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars defense. But obviously, who benefits from that? None other than Demario Davis. So guess what? I like him in this spot. Last week, he had a touchdown. He had his best game of the year with those 9 targets, 6 catches for, I think it was high 80 yards. I don't have the exact number in front of me. Should have pulled that before this. But it's the best opportunity you're going to have. If you wanted to fab dump on him and you picked him up on the waivers, you have to play him this week, because after this week, the schedule gets brutal. The next 5 cornerbacks that he is going to see after he plays the Jacksonville Jaguars, who allow the most points to the wide receiver position, is Sauce Gardner, L'Jarius Sneed, Jalen Johnson from the Chicago Bears, and then Jalen Ramsey from the Dolphins. Then he also gets the Rams defense, who are another top 10 team against the wide receiver position. So all I'm saying is, if you had the confidence to pick him up, you better have the confidence to start him, because he is just going to ride your bench for those matchups if you do not play him now.
I'm going to keep it in that Vikings-Lions game, and I'm going to go with Jameson Williams, who's been very, very good this season, facing a Vikings defense who has been pretty good under Brian Flores, but not good against receivers. They allow the 3rd most fantasy points to wide receivers, an average of 35.9. The Lions also average the 3rd most yards per game, and they're the 9th most in points, but they've scored a lot of points these last 2 weeks. Jameson Williams has 14-plus fantasy points in 4 out of 5 games this season. He also has 75 yards and 4 touchdowns in 4 out of 5 games this season. So he's been very, very reliable and kind of taking over Laporta's role as that number 2 receiving option for Jared Goff. And he's a downfield threat that Amon-Ra St. Brown isn't. Amon-Ra's going to catch a lot of those possession balls between 1 to 20 yards, but then there's Jameson Williams running a streak down the sideline. So I think this matchup is super duper fantasy friendly. I think there's a chance we see a lot of it on Red Zone. And I think we're going to see a big receiver frenzy, and the quarterbacks will have good matchups too.
I hope so.
All right. Your tight end.
I'm going with Dalton Schultz. He's a guy I've kind of made fun of on the show for the last couple of weeks, because he's one of the slowest players that's out on the NFL field. But guess what? I like some numbers that I'm seeing over the last few weeks. So week 1 and week 2, he had 3 targets in each of those games. Week 3 and week 4, he had 5 targets in each of those games, which is not great for the tight end position. The last 2 weeks, 6 targets, and this past week, 8 targets. So what changed over those 2 games? Well, Nico Collins got hurt. He got put on the IR. He's out this week. And what happens? Dalton Schultz is the beneficiary of it. 8 targets last week, the full game without Nico Collins, in a game where CJ Stroud only threw the ball 30 times. Now, you go up against the Packers, who allowed the 2nd most points to the tight end position, and it is supposed to be one of the higher scoring over-under games on the week. Dalton Schultz, huge touchdown upside and getting a big target share with no Nico Collins. Expect CJ Stroud to have to throw the ball a lot more. than he has, and I like the opportunity for Dalton here.
I'm going to go with Kyle Pitts, a guy, again, literally every few weeks we rotate Kyle Pitts. I think last week he was on Nick's all-boom team.
He was.
Facing my Seattle Seahawks, who stink. They're very, very bad on defense. They are just not good. They allow the 5th most fantasy points, 2 tight ends, an average of 10.5. They've allowed 9+ fantasy points to 4 different tight ends this season. This is the highest over-under of the week, 51.5. The Seahawks and the Falcons, a lot of fantasy points to be scored. And Kyle Pitts has double digits in 3 out of 6 games, so hopefully he can make it a nice 4 out of 7 here. All right, your flex play.
I'm going to keep it in this game. Nick, you said we are not allowed to start, and this is our rule. It's one of the unwritten rules. We're not allowed to all boom top receivers. So I couldn't put DK in here, but I am going to put Jackson Smith.
I think DK is eligible. With all these dumb fumbles he's been doing, he is not a top receiver. I don't care what the numbers say. DK's eligible.
He is a top receiver. He got 2 touchdowns. He got screwed on this past week, which screwed one of my fantasy teams. But we're going to focus on my guy, JSN, a guy that I have never had on the all-boom team or never had on the all-bust team, but he's been pretty good this year. So the Falcons allow the top 10 points in the league to the wide receiver position. JSN is getting a ton of targets. He actually leads the team in receptions from all the Seahawks players. Now he's coming off the mini bye, having played on Thursday last week in one of the highest over-under games of the year. Some other good Seattle Seahawks stats. Last year, I hated the Seahawks. The reason I didn't like them was Pete Carroll's offense is way too slow. Well, they've totally changed the script on that. Now they run the 3rd most plays per game. Last year, they ran the least amount of plays per game. They have the most passing attempts per game with Geno Smith. Geno Smith also leads the league in passing yards, big number, and then they actually lead the league in pass percentage. So this offense, which Nick can tell you he's hated because it's just been why we always running the ball, Pete Carroll, is now, well, we probably don't need to pass the ball as much because they put that ball in the air more than any other team in football. And with those stats, that's something that can support 2 top 24 wide receivers. And DK and JSN, they're starting to trend towards that. And even Tyler Lockett. Tyler Lockett's had the most consistent season he's had in his career. I believe he has 5 out of 6 games over double-digit fantasy points, which is big. He has not really had.
He doesn't age. He's a great Seahawk. I think I got to get his jersey at some point because he is a great Seahawk. He's not going to be a Hall of Famer, but he's a great Seahawk.
He's like a Ring of Honor guy. He's been there for so long.
Yeah, he's a great Seahawk.
Yeah.
All right. My flex play, I have Wan'Dale Robinson. I think we can still use him on all boom teams, even though he's been very, very consistent here.
Definitely.
Facing the Eagles defense, who was very bad against receivers last year and is just as bad this year, allowing the 6th most fantasy points, 2 wide receivers, an average of 32.2 per game. They've allowed double digits in 5 out of 6. Wan'Dale Robinson has scored double-digit fantasy points in 5 out of 6 games this season. He has 8+ targets in 5 out of 6 games this season. And the Eagles have given up 5 touchdowns to slot wide receivers. That's the 2nd most in the league. The Wan'Dale Robinson does play most of his plays from the slot. I know Neighbors is set to return, but if Neighbors doesn't, there's an even better opportunity for Wan'Dale Robinson. But even when Neighbors has been in there, Daniel Jones just loves to find him. So I have no concerns about putting him in your lineup.
Yeah.
Going to kick it now to the all-bust teams for week 7. Who is your all-bust quarterback?
Nick, I'm going to bust him, and you can yell at me after.
Is it Geno?
No, it's Joe Burrow.
I'm okay with that. He's bad against the Browns. I'm starting Baker over Burrow, and I'm starting Geno over Burrow. And you could give the stats, but I know he is bad against the Browns. I do know that.
Yes, he is.
I'm not against this take because that is one of those weird matchups where it's a weird divisional matchup.
Someone has your numbers.
And some of those weird divisional matchups, like when the Seahawks used to play the Rams, I would always bench Russell Wilson and DK because it was never a good game.
This to me is the corner red zone game because I hate the Bengals. And I hate the Browns, so
this
I
could
do
be
not
very
want to
low
watch.
scoring.
I don't want to watch the Subway series or the Walmart Subway series of football in the Battle of Ohio. By the way, whoever wins, you can keep Ohio. No one wants you anyway. That's totally fine with me. But regardless, sorry for all of our Ohio fans out there. But I'm not a fan of your state. Anyway, so here's my problem with Joe Burrow, and it's something that gets ignored. Joe Burrow, I don't think is as good of a quarterback as we make him out to be. And some of these numbers are kind of jarring to me. Joe Burrow is there's other players like this in other sports. And Nick, when I say it, I feel like you'll think of it a lot better than I am right now. He plays to the level of his competition. So when he's
Yes.
playing those upper teams,
The Seahawks did
plays
it every
better.
single year in the Pete Carroll era. I'm sorry to cut you off, but it was like
Yeah.
they played down to like the Bucks when the Bucks are really bad. But I
Yeah.
do understand what you mean.
That's a good comp. So
They do not crush anybody. I
So
think it's more on Zach
here's
Taylor than Burrow, but you're correct.
so here's my problem with Burrow. So here's his 3 best fantasy football games of the year. The Chiefs, who have the best defense in football, maybe
Yes.
Then obviously the Ravens aren't great against receiver, the Commanders. But those are the 3 best teams in football that they faced. They've lost all 3 of those games, by the way. But those are his 3 best fantasy football games. In those games, he has 10 touchdowns and 1 interception. That's mind-bogglingly good considering how good those teams are. So now here's his stats against the bottom teams, the Panthers, the Patriots, the Giants, 3 teams that we would have said you should absolutely smoke. Those are easy chalked up wins on your schedule. Well, he has 3 touchdowns and 1 pick in those games. So now he goes up against the Cleveland Browns, who are the worst team in football. And the Browns,
Really,
like Nick
I don't
mentioned,
know. The Jaguars are pretty bad, but you're right. The Browns are pretty
they're
good.
they're down there. Well, hold on. We'll get to the Jags much later on the show. But Jags big 5.5 point favorites, by the way, against the Patriots. So maybe the Patriots, maybe you could say the Patriots are the worst team in football, but the Patriots beat this team. So I don't even want to hear it. So anyway, so I think the Browns are the worst team in football. They just also traded away Amari Cooper. We talked about it at the top of the show. But the Browns are a team that have had Joe Burrow's number. Here are Joe Burrow's last 4 games against the Browns. I talked about touchdowns to interceptions, 3-1 against the bad teams this year, 10-1 against the top teams. He's 4 touchdowns to 4 interceptions in 4 games. Horrible for fantasy. Well, maybe he makes it up in the air. Maybe he gets him down the field and Joe Mixon was just vulturing touchdowns. It was 202 yards per game. You want to know who averaged 202 yards per game last year? Russell Wilson. Not good. Not good. Not good enough for my fantasy team. I hate Joe Burrow this week. I dislike him most weeks. But
I will
really
back you on this. I will back you on this, but I will not back you on is that he is the quarterback 4 on the season and has outplayed other people that were drafted ahead of him. And he only has 1 stinker. He has over 17 fantasy points in every game but 1. So although his football team has not played well against some of those teams, and the Giants game was bad, but credit to the Giants defensive line that is very good against a bad Bengals offensive line. No excuse for the Panthers, though. Could have played better against that one. And the Patriots, again, Zach Taylor should be fired. But I do agree with Nick. Historically, he plays very bad against the Browns. I think did you give the stat? I think he's only beaten the Browns once, maybe.
I didn't give that number. No,
I think he's. I don't want to claim it as fact, but he has been very, very bad against the Browns. All right, Nick. Pittsburgh Steelers. Here we go.
Oh yeah.
What are they doing? They are 4-2. They are 4-2, I believe. From a fantasy perspective, Fields is the quarterback 6, and you're benching him. This is blatant disrespect. And I love Russ. Like, Russ is one of my favorite players of all time. I think he should be traded. Have you seen a quarterback this disrespected? I'm not saying that Fields has played well, but he hasn't played bad. He hasn't lost in football games. Like the Steelers game. I mean, the Cowboy game, he didn't lose them that game. I forget the other game that they lost, but he's not losing them football games. Might not be winning them, but I don't know. It's nasty business to me, and it definitely feels like an ownership thing where it's like, oh, we took this guy, we whatever. Like he's a borderline Hall of Famer. Like we can't keep him on the bench. Like I don't know. Here's my other theory. My other theory is they actually do believe in Fields and don't want to throw him out against the Jets on prime time, and they want to throw Russell Wilson to the wolves. And here's why. First game for Russell Wilson in 2024, coming off whatever injury he had. I think it was a hammy or whatever it was. He was very good in 2023. It's quarterback 14 with quarterback 16 average, 17.1, beat the Chiefs, and he beat the Bills, and then he got hosed. He had a very bad team around him. He got hosed. Facing the Jets.
Can't forget that.
The Jets allowed the 3rd fewest fantasy points to quarterback at 11, and the Jets desperately need a win. I think Russ gets cooked in this one. It's not going to be good. I don't know if my theories are true or not, but if you even thought about playing Russ, maybe you had Fields as your starter, and maybe you picked up Russ. Maybe you're in a 14-person league. Don't play Russ. Play somebody else. Go to the Sunday morning live show and tell us who's on your waiver wire. I think the Jags are winning Sunday. I'm playing the Jags defense in 2 leagues because I am under the assumption there is no way the Jags shit the bed twice in London. There's just no way. And the line opened up on Monday pretty funky. I think the Pats were favored by like 3 or 4. I don't know. There's a funky line. I don't know. But anyway.
No. The Jags are favored by 5.5.
I do not think that the Jags are going to lose. And I could be wrong, but I am starting the Jags defense in a couple leagues. All right. Who's your first running back bust?
Well, you talked about the Steelers. Well, let's talk about a guy that's always on this list in Najee Harris. So the Jets, I know everybody saw him in primetime, said, what are you doing? Ray Davis is running all over you. The Jets are still the 7th best team against running backs this season. And Najee Harris is nowhere near as explosive as a young rookie Ray Davis. Najee Harris runs like he's the current age to Adrian Peterson at like 40 years old, who's also out of money, which is horrible to hear and sad for him. But guess what? Manage your money better. Anyways, Najee Harris, horrible. Not a great runner, not very efficient. Is consistent because he gets the workload. When he gets in the end zone, it's a good game like he did last week for the first and only time this season. And listen, that's fine. But his numbers aren't great. The last 3 games that he played, his rushing attempts went down. The first 3 games, he averaged 19 per game. The last 3 averaged a little over 13, a little less than 14 per game. And he only has 2 targets in each of the last 2 games. That is not great. Now, I will say check down Russ should be better for that PPR number. But there is no way that Russell Wilson and this team is marching that Jets defense all the way down the field like Josh Allen did on Monday night. I don't care what you want to think. The only way it's happening is if Aaron Rodgers turns the ball over. And Aaron Rodgers, I know he had the big 3 turnover game against the Minnesota Vikings. He is not a turnover quarterback. That has never been the way that he's played. I don't think that is the way that he plays. No. I don't see the Steelers forcing multiple turnovers and giving Najee Harris an upside to score touchdowns at the goal line.
I'm kicking things off here with Jahmyr Gibbs. There's a little bit of inconsistencies, I'd say this season. I don't know if I'd use the word bust per se, but he was drafted very high, and I was concerned at how high he was being drafted due to David Montgomery and due to some injuries. So right now, Jahmyr Gibbs, I have to scroll down to find him. He's running back 13. He's behind Montgomery. Montgomery's running back 10. Facing the Vikings, who allowed the second fewest points to running backs, an average of 13.3. They held Josh Jacobs to 11.8 and just held Breece Hall to 6.7. And I think Gibbs is pretty close to Breece Hall. Breece can run in between the tackles where Gibbs really can't, but Breece catches a lot of balls and so does Gibbs. So I wouldn't be shocked if this was more of a Monty game, but I think overall the running back position would be a little bit tough for the Lions, even though Dan Campbell's going to want to pound it down their throats. But yeah, it's going to be a tougher match for Gibbs, and I think he's going to continue to underperform. And running back 13 is underperforming compared to his 80.
Well, he did also have a bye week. Let's give him that.
Let's go off the average then. If you're going off the average, he's running back 10, and Montgomery's running back 8.
The problem is he has not finished. I don't think he's finished in the top 10 yet this season.
Does he have any touchdowns? Does he have 1?
He has 4 this season.
Huh. I feel that maybe I watch too much football. Maybe I watch too much football, but I feel like every time I watch a Lions game, it was Montgomery.
What's crazy is David Montgomery, and you could check this. I'm going to go off my dome because I have Gibbs stats up here. I am pretty confident last week David Montgomery, with as great of a week as he had, only had like a 31% snap share. They only give him the ball. Whenever he's on the field, they just give him the ball. Dan Campbell loves David Montgomery more than any coach has loved any NFL play.
They paid him. Dan Campbell chose to pay him the first time, and then they just paid him on Monday.
Yeah. It's so bizarre. Think about this. David Montgomery was a Bear. Now he's a Lion. DeAndre Swift was a Lion. He made his way over to the Bears. Now DeAndre Swift had the worst starting 3 games of the season, has been the RB1 since those bad 3 games. And then you have David Montgomery, who's the most consistent running back like in the NFL at the moment.
What did you say Montgomery's snap number was?
31%.
31%.
Look at that.
31%. His snap shares throughout the season are 49, 35, 51, 40, and 31.
Insane. and RB top 10 running back on the season with a bye week already. Anyway, next running back, James Cook. He's cooked. And if it's Ray Davis, we'll cook Ray Davis too. We'll find out on Friday. But anyways, the Titans are a top 5 team against the runs. The Bills are on a short week. I know James Cook did not play, but that offensive line has got to be beat up from playing that Jets front seven, who is tough. I don't care what anyone wants to say. And Ray Davis, to my point, did look pretty good. And I do think that if James Cook is a little banged up and they do roll him out there, they're not going to play him as much as he should be played because they have a younger rookie they can pivot to against one of the league's worst teams in the league. And I talked about the Titans defense. The Titans have one of the most underrated defenses in football at the moment. Last week against Trey Sermon, who is not the running back James Cook is, he had 18 carries or 18 touches for 29 yards. That's not great. So to me, James Cook is going to have to be touchdown or bust. And we've watched the Bills. They played really well against the Jets, but that's a big emotional game. That was a huge week 6 game for them. I think that they're going to come off that high on the short week. I think they struggle. I'm gonna check what the spread is. But Buffalo's a 9-point favorite in this game. I would guess the Titans cover that pretty easily because I can't see them going from an emotional game to a
they might rip apart Will Levis, though. I mean, Levis is so bad.
Yeah, listen. Will Levis is going to have that turnover that keeps the game close, or won't let them catch up. But you know what I mean.
All right. Here's what's funny, Nick. I gave you 2 receivers for the same game in my all boom, and I'm giving you 2 running backs that are busting in the same game. Same exact game for all 4 players because Aaron Jones is going to be a bust as well. I love picking on the Lions defense in a good way because they're really good against running backs. They allow the 3rd fewest points to running backs, an average of 14.6. They were great against running backs last year. Now, losing Aiden Hutchinson could affect this a little bit, but they've been very, very good. I mean, they allowed lows to both Kyron Williams at 14.4 and James Conner at 3.5. So, again, they've been very, very tough on running backs. I think the only running back that's really had a successful game against them was Kenneth Walker, who's just been an explosive, super-duper explosive touchdown machine this season. So, yep, a bust across the board with the running backs in that game and booms on the receiving side.
Like it.
All right, your first receiver.
So I talked about Najee Harris. Now I'm going to talk about another player on the Steelers. We don't like stacking, but we're going to stack here. George Pickens.
Every week. Him and Najee. Every week.
Every week they're on one of these teams. It's funny. Our anonymous source literally replied and said, LOL, George Pickens again. And I said, I'll switch him out if you want me to. And he goes, no, it's your team. Stick with it. And I said, okay, I'll stick with it. Anyway, listen, I am not trusting most receivers against Sauce Gardner. It's not going to happen. And I am not trusting Russell Wilson's wide receiver 1. It's never going to happen. Listen, I get it. Last year, 1,000-yard receiver, 5 touchdowns, super talented, improved quarterback play. Did I hear this before? Oh, it's the Broncos from a couple years ago. Veteran head coach, smart brain, makes a lot of sense. No, Cortland Sutton, Jerry Jeudy, we overdrafted them for 2 seasons with 2 different offensive coaches and different talented receivers. We said would be a stud with Russ. It's never happened. It's not happening this year. This team is purely a run-first team. They do not want Russell Wilson to throw the ball. They want him to be check down Charlie in this matchup, and that's exactly what he's going to do. He's going to find a way to get to 200 yards, and it's going to be dink and dunk. Skip loves to call him dink and dunk Dak. I like check down Charlie for Russ. That's what I like for him. And listen, George Pickens, everybody ragged on him for the last couple of weeks because he's been another Steelers diva receiver. He deserves it for sure. Well, guess what? Pickens has had 2 games, 2 good games this year. Wide receiver 23 and wide receiver 24. He was drafted around that range. Every other week has been less than 10 fantasy points, averaging 7.4 in that game. And the last time he was shadowed and had to prove himself in a big matchup, it was Pat Surtain who held him for less than 5. Sauce Gardner, to me, is a cornerback at that level. DJ Reed has been the number 1 ranked cornerback by PFF. If he gets either one of those 2 corners, he is not having over 10 fantasy points in this game.
This is becoming my favorite bit this season. Michael Pittman's going to be a bust. And the bit isn't that Pittman's going to be a bust. The bit is that Anthony Richardson is going to make Michael Pittman a bust. Yep. I love the bit. I'm committed to it. And I've been committed to it since the offseason. I just didn't think it was going to be this bad. Anyway, on top of, so Richardson coming back, Pittman's played 6 games. He is under 10 fantasy points in all 3 games with Anthony Richardson, and he is over 13 in all 3 games with Flacco. They're also facing the Dolphins, who allow the 3rd fewest fantasy points to wide receivers, an 18.7 average, and Jalen Ramsey. Yeah, it's bad all around. I know a buddy last week who had Pittman in his starting lineup because he thought that Flacco was going to start. Then when he saw that Richardson was going to start, he pulled Pittman out, and then he put him back in. So, yeah, I'm sorry, guys. If you're a Pittman owner, I own him in 0 leagues, but this is going to be a problem this season with Anthony Richardson at quarterback. So.
Yeah.
Wide receiver 2.
I want to stick to Pittman for a second. So being the friend in my friend group with the Fantasy Football Podcast, I get a lot of calls and a lot of texts about trade offers. I'm sure Nick gets it too. Of like, should I make this trade? Should I not make this trade? So I have a good friend of mine who is not a big football fan, does not know the intricacies of the game, but loves fantasy football, loves sports gambling. He was offered to trade away Tyreek Hill for Michael Pittman and Tyler Lockett. And me as a fantasy football analyst said, no, you're trading Tyreek Hill at his low. You're taking for 2 guys on their high. And he looks at me, and you know what he said to me? He goes, look at Michael Pittman's stats the last week. How are you not going to take him over Tyreek Hill? And I said, buddy, because Anthony Richardson is coming back. Like, that's one of those things that's just locked and loaded. Totally agree with Nick. We do not like AR. Anyway, all right, so I talked about 2 Steelers. I'm going to talk about 2 Bills. Running back, wide receiver combo. Not Amari Cooper, Khalil Shakir. Had him on the team before Amari Cooper was traded, but this even makes my case a little bit better. I don't mind busting Amari Cooper either, but I'm going to stick with Shakir because I don't want to do Amari Cooper dirty. I'm sure he's going to wind up on an all-boomer and all-bust team every single week for the rest of the season or something close to that. Anyways, so Cooper's clearly going to get the lion's share of the work, and Cooper is going to be the better slot receiver, which is why a lot of my concerns for Shakir come in. Shakir has been the slot guy for this team. It's been Matt Collins on one side, Keon Coleman on the other, and Khalil Shakir in the slot. There is no way they're going to line Amari Cooper out on the outside often. I think that Khalil Shakir's role, if anything, would be similar to Christian Kirk, where he comes in on those 3 wide receiver sets, and that's about it. The problem is Amari Cooper should take over that slot work, and Khalil Shakir is going to see the biggest hit from it. Last year with Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis, both of them lined up on the outside, and Shakir was still the slot guy, which is why he was still pretty good for fantasy in those games. Not going to be as good this year when you bring in a full-time slot receiver. So that's not great. And then on top of that, if they do want to move him to the outside, well, he's going to see the Tennessee Titans, who allow the second least amount of points to the wide receiver position, and he's more talented than Keon Coleman. He's going to see L'Jarius Sneed, which is a horrible matchup for any receiver in this league.
I'm glad you mentioned him because I'm busting Amari Cooper for all the same reasons that Nick mentioned. I mean, the Titans allow the second fewest points to receivers at 18. We've been consistently busting receivers against them this season. And he just got traded. I know he's playing with an elite quarterback in Josh Allen, but you got to learn a new playbook. And you got traded on Tuesday and your game is on Sunday. The Davante Adams situation is different because he played with Aaron Rodgers for 6 years. Like, it's totally different. So I think it could be an adjustment period for Cooper, and this is just a tough matchup, for that adjustment to happen.
Sure.
Who's your tight end?
I'm going with David Njoku. We're busting more Browns here because we don't like the Browns, and we're going to talk about them a little bit. So I know what people are thinking. Amari Cooper was traded. David Njoku is the most talented weapon on this team. Totally agree with you. Game script should be good. Totally agree with you. The problem is David Njoku is not as good as he was at the end of last year with Joe Flacco. The first 6 games of the year, David Njoku was on waiver wires. He was on in less than 50% of leagues. He was dropped everywhere because Deshaun Watson wasn't the answer. After Deshaun Watson was not the quarterback, David Njoku rest of the season was the tight end 1 on the year. Well, guess what? Deshaun Watson's a problem, and he is not going to be good for fantasy. David Njoku, I talked to earlier about Joe Burrow's kryptonite being the Cleveland Browns. Well, David Njoku's been the Cincinnati Bengals. He's played against them 7 times in his career, or over the last 7 times. He's only had 1 of those games over 3 targets. So the Cincinnati Bengals apparently, and Zach Taylor, no, let's just eliminate David Njoku from this game. On top of that, you might think, well, maybe he gets yak, maybe he gets catches down the field, maybe he gets touchdowns. Only 1 of those games, he had over 25 yards. And now in his entire career, he's averaging 2.5 catches per game for 30 yards against this team. That's 5.5 points. when you want to start the tight end position, your goal is 10. If you can get a guy that you think is going to get you 10 points, that's a fine play at the tight end position if you don't have one of those upper dogs. So I don't think David Njoku makes sense to start. I understand the excitement with Amari Cooper. There might be better games ahead for him, but this is not going to be the matchup. And once we get Jameis Winston, we are going to send David Njoku to the moon.
Yeah. I am busting Tucker Kraft. So he's facing the Texans, who allow the third fewest points to tight ends, an average of 5.2. I've spoken about it on previous shows before. The Packers do have an inconsistent fantasy football offense in the sense where the ball is going to be spread around. Love will throw for 250 and 2 or 3 touchdowns, but you don't know who's going to get that 250 and 3 touchdowns. And it was not Tucker Kraft last week, and I don't think it'll be Tucker Kraft this week. Only one tight end has scored over 7 fantasy points against the Texans this season. And Texans are only and tight ends are only averaging about 25 yards against the Texans this season. So I think it's a good opportunity for those other receivers, maybe Jacobs, but not Tucker Kraft this week. Your last player, who do you got?
I'm going with Juju Smith-Schuster. He was one of the most targeted waiver wire guys 2 weeks ago and this past week if he was not added in your league because the Chiefs were on the bye. Now going up against the San Francisco 49ers. They're kind of middle of the pack, but they are in the top half against wide receivers. But I think a lot of people are giving Juju Smith-Schuster way too much confidence for a guy that wasn't good enough to be a Patriots wide receiver, frankly. And if you're not good enough to be on the Patriots, you're probably not good enough to be a superstar week in and week out. Listen, of course, Kansas City, you want the number 1 over there. Guess what? They didn't have a number 1 last year. None of their receivers finished inside the top 30 outside of Rashee Rice near the end of the season where he snuck his way in there. None of these guys are going to do it. If you have confidence in any, you would think it's Xavier Worthy. Xavier Worthy doesn't get the workload. He doesn't get that guaranteed timeshare that you need and the guaranteed touches to be good enough to be a fantasy superstar in this league. So if I had to guess on one guy that's going to give you the big week for the Kansas City Chiefs, I already told you him. Kareem Hunt and the Boom Team, 6 catches last year. Last year in the Super Bowl against the 49ers, the Kansas City Chiefs had 9 different pass catchers get targeted, 8 different guys catch balls. None of them had superstar fantasy days. So I do not trust any of these Kansas City Chiefs. I think they find a way to win as they do every single week, but it's not going to be the way you want.
I am going to bust Jordan Mason or whoever is the 49ers running back. I think Mason's going to play. Facing the Kansas City Chiefs, who allow the fewest fantasy points to running backs, an average of 12.6. They've allowed lowest rushes so far. So Derrick Henry only had 10.6. It's the lowest of the season. Both Zach Moss and Chase Brown were both under 6 fantasy points. Bijan Robinson at 13.2, Dobbins 9.2, and then Alvin Kamara was a low as well at 12.6. So those are your top 2 backs on the season, Henry and Kamara, that both had lows against these Kansas City Chiefs. Mason is a little bit banged up, so if he does play, he probably will be a little bit banged up. And if it's not Mason, it's a backup back who's just not as talented as Mason or McCaffrey, and that's just the reality of it. So I would not play the 49ers running back this week against the Kansas City Chiefs, coming off a bye. I don't know Andy Reid's record off a bye. I'm pretty sure Nick gave it to me last year. I bet it's really good. And maybe you're wrong, but I'm pretty sure Nick gave me that stat last year.
I think it's 21-4.
I think it's something really crazy because I'm pretty sure Nick gave this stat last year on the All Boom team. But again, we can't fact check it at the moment, but I think
also fun fact for my sports gamblers out there: the Chiefs are underdogs right now in this game. Fun fact. So makes no sense to me. I do not think any game with Patrick Mahomes, Andy Reid off a bye with a top 5 defense should ever be an underdog in this league. But
no,
listen, man,
I should bet it because every time he's an underdog, he always does it.
He as an underdog, by the way, he's got like a 75 to 80% win rate.
They just did this in the Super Bowl. And the Niners aren't like a juggernaut this year. So anyway, all right, guys, that was a little bit of a longer show, but we did have that news at the beginning, so that's okay. It does happen. Had to talk about it. So hopefully you enjoyed it. We just gave you 14 booms and 14 busts. If we didn't talk about your players, those is we can't talk about everybody. Join our live show Sunday morning, 8:30 a.m. Eastern time, YouTube, Facebook, or Instagram to answer all of your fantasy football questions. Our show will lead right into the Pats and the Jaguars in London. And we'll keep going. We went about 30 minutes into the game last week because people still had questions. We'll keep answering your questions up until the time that game starts. So with that said, thank you guys for watching. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the show and you're watching on YouTube, make sure to drop a like on this video. Subscribe to us on our social media channels and on our audio streaming platforms. And aside from that, we'll talk to you guys on Sunday for week 7.